Star Trek's lore isn't so much a coherent future history as an accretion of 6 decades of cultural reflection laid down in layers. Sort of a cultural core sample that reflects a rather significant shift in our self-perception. And Trek has always had some short-term pessimism baked in. The original series makes several references to global war in the late 20th and early 21st centuries.
They do seem to have escaped the carnage of your first 3 world wars. The mid-1990s was the era of your last so-called World War.
The eugenics wars.
And Colonel Green, who led a genocidal war early in the 21st century on Earth.
This clears the way for the rise of a new golden age for humanity. But the details have changed in ways that reflect something rather troubling about the culture in America and really the West in general. Zephram Cochrane, inventor of the warp drive, was introduced in the original series episode Metamorphosis.
Zephram Cochrane? Of Alpha Centauri? The discoverer of the space warp?
One implication from this is that he built the first warp drive while living in the Alpha Centauri system, which would have been colonized by ships traveling at sublight speeds. It could also be taken that he relocated there after inventing the drive, but the phrasing kind of always implied the former more than the latter to me. The 1994 novel Federation goes with Cochrane's first warp flight being to the Alpha Centauri system and subsequently establishing a colony there funded by a wealthy benefactor. The film First Contact reworks things, with Cochrane building his warp drive in a fallout village near Bozeman, Montana. His first flight, which for movie reasons goes nowhere, draws the attention of the Vulcans, who step in to guide us as a sort of benevolent space dad. These are profoundly different stories. Humanity going out into the cosmos and meeting others as equals has transformed into, essentially, the elves come to help us solve problems we couldn't solve ourselves. A top-down approach. The original series is a product of the late 60s, the era of both the Vietnam War and Apollo. We had immense troubles at home with the war, the protests against it, the conflict around the civil rights movement of the era, and several high-profile assassinations. It was a turbulent time, but also looking outward and forward. Star Trek reflects all of these threads, foreseeing both terrible wars and mankind getting back on its feet, heading to the stars, and forging partnerships with other civilizations. But by the mid-90s, when First Contact was released, we were into the end of history period. The Cold War tensions were mostly gone, but so was the drive. I certainly can't speak for everyone that was alive at the time, but my own perspective was that it was a time of coasting, an in-between time, which turns out to have been more or less right. Now, of course, I see 90s Trek as one of the highlights of the era. There is definitely a personal attachment there. It's foundational. But I also have to acknowledge that 90s Trek depicts a much more rigid society, stiffer and more self-righteous than the old series. At least to a point, it reflects a more bureaucratic and stagnant tendency in a wider culture. And one illustrative example is how the public attitude toward the manned space program has shifted. Now, I'm not going to argue why it's a good way to spend money or for a utopian vision of terraformed Mars. I'm pointing to a change in perception. In the era of the original series, the Apollo program was a matter of national pride, and people were excited about it, not just as a contest to beat the Russians, but more so because landing on the damn moon was seen as a big deal. People have looked up at it since people existed. It's even an idiom for something unattainable. Might as well wish for the moon, as they'd say. And suddenly people are going there. Americans are going there. That LEM landing stage sitting on the moon is a lasting cultural achievement on par with the pyramids. It's a monument to confidence and ingenuity. A lot of people don't even know that we currently have a manned moon program, Project Artemis. The astronauts are already selected. Launch dates are tentatively planned for a flyby mission slated for 2026. Most people don't know, and half of those that do don't care. SpaceX is optimistically looking at Mars missions this decade, Again, there's widespread meh whatever about it. There's a deep cultural stagnation that is reflected in Star Trek over the decades. The sense of decline becomes highly apparent in the first 2 seasons of Enterprise in the early aughts, where it's just rehashing old Trek material and just kind of feels tired most of the time. Season 3 gives us a war on terror analogy, which was fine for what it was, but not the uplifting, forward-looking Star Trek people expected. Later Trek, from the J.J. Abrams films through Kurtzman's New Trek, is very shallow, flashy and occasionally fun, but ultimately empty. Sort of a what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas version of Star Trek that's best forgotten by everyone involved. Strange New Worlds is kind of full-spectrum nostalgia, but again, more style than substance. The lack of soul in current Star Trek isn't just a result of bad writing, it's reflective of a cultural period that lacks confidence. Now, I want to make a distinction here between the techno-utopianism of Star Trek, where the frontier has an almost religious aspect where we'll somehow make ourselves better by going to the stars, and the more basic idea of expanding resources and inhabited places. Right now, it's a fairly academic distinction because only major nation states and their cozy defense contractors can get into space at great expense. But Mars is no more a frontier than Antarctica, not because it's an inhospitable environment, but because existing powers won't allow you to have free reign, even if you can get there. Now, there are a lot of pieces to this, but since we're talking Star Trek, I'm going to come back to the space program as a shorthand for wider cultural shifts. Some will make a very practical, materialist, you could say, argument that space missions are high cost and don't deliver much. We stop trying to go to those places because it's expensive and dumb. And you can make a very solid near-term economic argument for that. There's also a more esoteric argument that space as the final frontier was a modern myth, one that was slain by postmodernism breaking down the assumptions of that narrative and finding it to be lacking. And now we need to find a new story that better fits our time. I think there is something to that. Cultural narratives can be profoundly important, but I don't think it's that linear. There's a cyclical nature to it. Back to that distinction again. If we deconstruct the narratives of starships and aliens, grand interstellar coalitions, and the triumph of liberalism across the galaxy, we're really just setting aside a story from an earlier generation, a way of thinking about the world that hasn't played out quite the way it was envisioned. But if we say space is expensive and sending people out there is stupid, we're setting aside the entire human past of expanding into new territories and overall growth, both material and knowledge. Obviously, a human can't survive on the surface of Mars. A bare-assed human with no tools can't survive a winter in Winnipeg either. Using technology to open new environments is part of what we do. As our technological capacity increases, so does the range of inhabitable spaces. And frontier narratives in various forms are part of that process. Maybe a new version of that prior myth serves us better than further deconstructing all the myths. That's what drives cultures to do crazy, expensive, stupid things that end up infusing them with new vitality and carrying them forward. Just one of many examples. Sailing across the Atlantic in little ships meant for the Mediterranean because some guy thinks he can get to India that way was not a sensible thing to do. But the discovery of the Americas spurred the European powers forward to new heights, to new levels of cultural, economic, and technological development. Star Trek used to be that story for us, the promise of greatness ahead. I don't think it is anymore, but that doesn't mean that we're at some pivotal moment where the species turns away from growth and from expansionism, from the call of frontiers, and for the first time embraces some kind of solar punk sustainable equilibrium. I don't think that's who we are. But Star Trek's vision of a benevolent space navy binding a coalition of like-minded civilizations was a story of the World War II generation. A new Star Trek, something to replace that cultural role, probably looks more like The Expanse, minus all the dreary pessimism, than it does Trek nostalgia. More about building habitats than fighting Klingons. No zipping between stars in the span of a commercial break to meet another strange alien species, but rather humans bringing life to places where it had not existed before. Human cultures branching out in new directions with their new environments, entangling with each other as they grow, using resources from the solar system to develop it. And maybe some far-off day, people will go to another star to repeat the process. On our own, without a guiding hand from paternalistic space elves. Now, I can see that this might mean that I'm a bit of a relic, hanging on to the modern myth by my fingernails. But I think it's worth hanging on to, partly because the frontier story has been with us in some form for so long that it's tangled up with everything else we are. And attempts to break clean from the past and start with something new have a tendency to end badly, whether in bland postmodern stories or bloody, awful political experiments. But on a far more basic level, civilizations rarely get a second chance to grab onto the future. And I would hate for us to miss ours. I've had a few people now report that YouTube has mysteriously unsubscribed them from this channel, so that's a huge milestone, I think, and, check that subscribe status.